The American Civil War is finally over. Millions of people are celebrating in the streets. The nation is reunited. Slavery is abolished. But just 5 days after that victory, a single gunshot silences an entire nation. Today, I'm taking you back to April 14, 1865, the night that changed American history forever. Welcome to Midnight Evidence. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. Born in a log cabin to a poor frontier family. No formal education. Taught himself to read by firelight. Became a lawyer, then a congressman, then the most powerful man in America. But when Lincoln was elected in 1860, the country was already tearing itself apart. The northern states wanted to abolish slavery. The southern states said, if that happens, we're leaving. And they did. 11 southern states broke away and formed the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began. 4 brutal years. Over 600,000 Americans dead. And on April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. The war was over. Lincoln had won. But that victory would cost him his life. John Wilkes Booth, 26 years old, by profession, an actor. And not just any actor. He was one of the most famous performers in America. Dark hair, sharp features, a commanding presence on stage that made audiences forget to breathe. But underneath that charm, he was a fanatic. Booth was a devoted Confederate sympathizer. He believed in slavery. He despised Lincoln with a hatred that had been building for years. When the war ended, something snapped inside him. The Confederacy had lost. Everything he believed in, gone. But Booth refused to accept it. He came up with a plan, not just to kill Lincoln. His plan was bigger. On the same night, Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward would also be assassinated. Kill all 3 at once. Cripple the U.S. government in a single night. Then Booth believed the Confederacy would rise again. He recruited a team. 8 conspirators in total. The date was set, April 14th, 1865. That evening, Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. was hosting a popular comedy, Our American Cousin. Lincoln hadn't wanted to go. He was exhausted. The work of rebuilding a broken nation weighed heavily on him, but the public knew he would be there. Thousands wanted to see him, so Lincoln went. Around 8 p.m., his carriage arrived at the theater. The audience rose to their feet. The orchestra struck up, "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln made their way up to the presidential box, a private balcony on the second floor, positioned directly beside the stage. The play began. But at that very moment, outside the theater, Booth was making his final preparations. 10:15 p.m. Booth entered through the back of the theater. He knew this building well. He had performed here many times as an actor. A guard was supposed to be stationed outside the presidential box, but that night, the guard had left his post to watch the play from a better angle downstairs. Booth reached the door, unchallenged. He had prepared earlier, drilling a small peephole in the door so he could observe Lincoln's exact position. He looked through. Lincoln was sitting in his rocking chair, leaning slightly forward, watching the stage, laughing. Booth opened the door. He stepped inside. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single-shot Derringer pistol, small enough to fit in a palm. 1 bullet. That's all he had. The distance between him and Lincoln, less than 5 feet. At 10:15 p.m., a deafening crack. The bullet entered the back of Lincoln's skull, just behind his left ear. Lincoln slumped forward. Mary Todd screamed. The theater erupted into chaos. Booth leapt from the box down to the stage, a drop of nearly 12 feet. As he landed, his boot spur caught on the decorative bunting draped along the box. He hit the stage hard. His left leg snapped, but he got up. He turned to face the horrified audience, raised his arm, and shouted, Sic semper tyrannis, Latin, meaning, thus always to tyrants. And he ran. A young doctor named Charles Leal was in the audience that night. He rushed up to the presidential box. One look at Lincoln told him everything he needed to know. The bullet had lodged deep inside the brain. There was no surgical option, no path to recovery. But Lincoln was still breathing. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, the Peterson House. Through the night, doctors worked desperately. Cabinet members, military officers, close friends, they crowded into that small room, standing in silence, watching the man who had saved their nation fade away. Mary Todd sat beside him, weeping uncontrollably. The night passed slowly. Then came the morning of April 15, 1865. 7:22 a.m. Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside. He removed his hat. He wiped his eyes. Then he said quietly, "Now he belongs to the ages." Those words have echoed through history ever since. Booth fled into the night. With a broken leg, he rode south on horseback, crossing out of Washington into Maryland. Along the way, he stopped at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set his fractured leg without knowing, or so he claimed, who Booth was. Meanwhile, the entire United States military was hunting him. Martial law was declared. Thousands of soldiers fanned out across the region. Booth hid in swamps, moved only at night. His leg was infected and agonizing. 12 days after the assassination, April 26, 1865, soldiers tracked him to a tobacco farm in Virginia, the Garrett Farm. They surrounded the barn where Booth was hiding. He refused to surrender. The barn was set on fire. Through the smoke and flames, a sergeant named Boston Corbett shot Booth through a gap in the barn wall. The bullet struck him in the neck, nearly the same location as Lincoln's wound. Booth was dragged outside. He was paralyzed, dying. As soldiers held him in the early morning light, Booth asked them to lift his hands so he could see them. He stared at his own hands and whispered, "Useless, useless." He died a few hours later. That same night, Booth's co-conspirators had carried out their own attacks. Lewis Powell forced his way into Secretary Seward's home and stabbed him multiple times. Seward survived, barely, but was left with permanent scars. George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Johnson, lost his nerve. He spent the night drinking at a hotel bar instead. Johnson was never touched. The conspirators were rounded up within days. 4 were sentenced to death: Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. They were hanged on July 7, 1865. Mary Surratt became the first woman ever executed by the United States federal government. Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated Booth's leg, was sentenced to life in prison. He was later pardoned. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln wasn't just the murder of one man. It was an attack on an idea. The idea that all people are created equal, that a nation torn apart by hatred could be healed. Lincoln died, but the idea didn't. Today, Ford's Theater still stands in Washington, D.C. The presidential box is preserved exactly as it was that night. The rocking chair is still there, the one Lincoln sat in during the final moments of his life. Every year, millions of people stand in front of that chair in silence, because history doesn't let us forget. This was America's Darkest Night. If you found this story compelling, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell me which case you want to see next. I'll be here. This is Midnight Evidence. True stories. Evidence from the dark.